Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental to how we see the digital world, the RGB color model. If you've ever looked at any kind of screen, really, any screen at all, you've definitely encountered it. So what exactly is RGB and, why is it such a cornerstone of our tech?
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you shared the Wikipedia page on RGB. And I have to say, it's quite the treasure trove.
Right.
Yeah. What's really striking is just the sheer scope. It covers everything from the basic science of how light mixes to create color, all the way through the history of RGB in things like, old photographs and early television.
Yeah, that history part was fascinating.
And then how it powers basically everything today, from our phone displays to the websites we browse.
Absolutely. So our goal today is really to pull out the most important bits from that source, give you a really clear, hopefully engaging understanding of what RGB is and why it's so vital in, the technology we use every single day.
Right.
And we want to do this without getting too bogged down in, overly technical jargon.
Makes sense.
Okay, so let's unpack the very core of it. The RGB color model is an additive color model. What does that fundamentally mean? How are colors actually created here?
Well, it basically boils down to this. Red, green, and blue light are your primary ingredients.
Okay.
And when you mix them together in various amounts, various intensities, you get this massive range of other colors.
Right.
Think of it like shining colored spotlights on a white screen. So if you overlap a red spotlight and a green one, the area where they meet looks yellow. Green and blue light together make cyan. Red and blue make magenta.
Okay.
Now, here's kind of a key aha moment.
Okay.
If you shine all three, red, green, and blue, together in equal full intensities, you get white light.
White light from colors.
Yeah. So in the digital world, on our screens, light adds together to create color, which is pretty different from how we usually think about mixing colors like paints.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you stop and think about it, yeah. It's completely the opposite of, mixing watercolors as a kid.
Precisely. Paints, inks, they use what's called a subtractive color model, usually CMY or CMYK cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, which is black.
Right, for printing.
Exactly. With subtractive colors, you start with white light hitting a surface, like paper, and the pigments in the paint or ink absorb certain wavelengths of that light.
Okay.
So if you mix, say, yellow and cyan paint, you get green. Why? Because the yellow paint absorbs blue light and the cyan paint absorbs red light, leaving only the green light to be reflected back to your eye.
I see.
And if you theoretically mix perfect subtractive primaries together, you get black because all the wavelengths of light would be absorbed, nothing reflected.
Okay, so digital screens. Adding light makes white. Paints. Mixing absorbs light makes black. Got it. Now, you mentioned components and intensity earlier. Can you break down what those terms mean for RGB?
Sure. So in the RGB model, each of those primary colors, red, green, and blue, is a component. Pretty straightforward. And the intensity just refers to how bright each of those color components is. It can range from completely off, zero intensity, to fully on, maximum intensity.
Like dimmer switches.
Exactly like dimmer switches. Imagine having one for your red spotlight, one for green, one for blue. By adjusting the brightness of each one and letting the light overlap, you can dial in practically any color you see on your screen.
That's a really clear way to picture it. Now, something else you brought up, or that was in the source, was that RGB is a device-dependent color model. What does that mean, practically speaking, for what we see?
Yes, this is important. What's kind of fascinating here is that the basic RGB model itself, it doesn't actually define exactly what red, green, and blue should look like in precise colorimetric terms.
So red isn't always the same red.
Well, the idea is red, but the actual appearance can vary. It means that different devices, say your phone screen versus your laptop display, or even two different TVs, might reproduce the very same RGB numerical value.
Like the code for a color.
Yeah, exactly. Let's say 25500, which should be pure bright red, but it might look slightly different on each device.
Why is that?
It's because the actual materials used to create the light, maybe the phosphors in an old CRT, or the tiny color filters and LEDs in an LCD screen, and how they respond to those red, green, and blue signals.
Yeah.
Well, they can vary from one manufacturer to another, or even between different models from the same company.
Okay, so if I'm looking at a website with a specific blue, say represented by certain RGB numbers, my friend looking at the same website on their monitor might see a slightly different shade of blue.
That's exactly it, unless there's something called color management involved.
Right.
That 25500 red could be a slightly different tint on your tablet compared to your TV.
Oh, right.
And that's why standardized color spaces like sRGB and Adobe RGB were created.
I've heard of those.
Yeah, they basically try to nail down the exact chromaticities, essentially, the purest hue and saturation of those red, green, and blue primaries, sort of independent of brightness, to provide a common reference point. So everyone's aiming for the same target colors.
Okay, so sRGB and Adobe RGB are like agreed upon dialects of RGB to make sure colors look more consistent across different screens. Got it.
Pretty much, yeah.
Now, let's zoom out a bit. Why red, green, and blue specifically? Is there a scientific reason those three were chosen as the primaries for adding light?
Oh, absolutely. It's not arbitrary at all. The choice is deeply connected to how our own eyes perceive color.
Our biology.
Yep. Our retinas have three main types of photoreceptor cells called cone cells. And these cones are most sensitive to light in different parts of the spectrum. Roughly speaking, one type responds most strongly to longer wavelengths, which we perceive around yellow-red.
Okay.
Another to medium wavelengths around green. And the third to shorter wavelengths, more like violet-blue.
Huh. So 3 types of cones, 3 primary colors.
Exactly. These sensitivities overlap quite a bit, but it's the unique combination of signals that our brain receives from these 3 cone types that allows us to perceive this huge range of colors we see. And interestingly, our eyes are actually most sensitive overall to light in the yellowish-green part of the spectrum. And we're best at distinguishing different shades in the sort of green to orange range.
So it's not just a random pick. Our own vision system is the fundamental reason for using red, green, and blue in this model.
Precisely. Even though the peak sensitivities of our cones aren't perfectly aligned with pure red, green, and blue light, those 3 colors are really effective at stimulating our 3 cone types to varying degrees.
Okay.
It essentially tricks our brain into perceiving all sorts of other colors that aren't physically present at single wavelengths, like orange light entering your eye.
Yeah.
It'll stimulate both the medium wavelengths, green sensitive cones, and the long wavelength, red-yellow sensitive cones. But the long wavelength cones will fire a bit more strongly. And it's that difference in signal strength that your brain interprets as the color orange.
Wow. Okay. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But I have heard, and the source mentioned this too, that RGB can't actually reproduce every single color humans can possibly see. Is that a limitation?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, the range of colors, the technical term is the gamut that can be created just by mixing the RGB primaries is indeed limited.
How so?
Well, if you imagine a map of all the colors the human eye can perceive, the specific red, green, and blue primaries, defined by a system like sRGB, form the corners of a triangle within that map.
Okay, a color triangle.
Right. And only the colors that fall inside that triangle can be accurately reproduced by simply adding non-negative amounts of that specific red, green, and blue light.
So colors outside the triangle.
They're at a gamut. They simply can't be created with that particular set of RGB primaries. Some very vibrant, saturated greens or cyans, for example, might fall outside the standard sRGB triangle. So while RGB covers a very wide and useful range, the digital world doesn't quite capture all the colors our eyes can theoretically perceive.
Okay, so it's an incredibly useful, very wide range, but yeah, not the entire spectrum of human vision. Fascinating. Let's switch gears now and talk about where this all came from. I was really surprised reading the source of the roots of RGB go way, way back, long before computers or anything like that.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting. The theoretical groundwork for RGB was actually laid back in the 19th century.
Really?
Yeah, you had the Young-Helmholtz theory of trichromatic color vision, basically proposing that our eyes have 3 types of color receptors popping up in the early to mid 1800s.
Okay.
And then James Clerk Maxwell, around 1860, built on that with his color triangle concepts. He was figuring out how colors mix.
And it sounds like photography was one of the very first practical ways this theory actually got used.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Maxwell himself did some really groundbreaking experiments in color photography using RGB principles way back in 1861.
1861, wow. How did that even work?
Well, his process was pretty ingenious for the time. He took 3 separate black and white photographs of the same scene. But each photo was taken through a different colored filter, one red, one green, and one violet blue.
Okay, so 3 black and white photos.
Right. Then, to create the color image, he had to project positive transparencies made from those photos simultaneously onto a screen in a dark room. And each projector had the corresponding color filter in front of it. Red filter, so the red filtered photo, green for green, blue for blue. Where the lights overlapped, they added together to recreate the original colors.
That seems incredibly fiddly, like a really elaborate setup for the 1860s.
It really was. And this additive RGB model, or variations on it, kept being the basis for early color photography tech, like the Autochrome Lumière plates.
Oh yeah, those are beautiful.
Aren't they? And other similar screen plate methods in the early 20th century. And there were pioneers like Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky in Russia.
Yeah.
Between about 1909 and 1915, he used a similar method, 3 separate exposures through colored filters to capture these absolutely stunning color photographs.
Amazing.
Interestingly, though, when they wanted to make physical prints from these 3-plate photos, they often switched to the complementary CMY model. So the negative from the red filtered shot would be used to create a cyan-toned print, the green negative for a magenta print, and the blue for yellow. Then they'd overlay those prints.
Ah, so RGB for capturing or projecting, CMY for printing. Makes sense. Okay, so RGB was right there at the dawn of color photography. What about the next big visual medium television. When did RGB jump over there?
Well, the story of color television is also deeply tangled up with RGB, though the very early systems were actually mechanical, not electronic.
Mechanical TV.
Yeah, believe it or not, patents for mechanically scanned color TV systems actually appeared as early as 1889 in Russia. But it was really John Logie Baird, a true visionary, who gave the world's first public demonstration of RGB color transmission back in 1928.
28? Okay.
And then the first actual color broadcast in London in 1938. His systems literally used mechanically spinning wheels, discs, divided into red, green, and blue segments. One at the transmitting camera and one at the receiving display, spinning in sync.
Spinning color wheels, that's just such a different image than, our sleek flat screens today.
Totally different. And later on, in 1940, CBS over in the U.S. experimented with an RGB system they called field sequential color. Now, the image scanning itself was electronic by then, but it still relied on a rotating RGB color wheel in both the camera and the receiver. And this wheel had to be perfectly synchronized with the way the image was being scanned line by line.
Still with the wheel.
Yep. And actually, much more recently, the idea of spinning color wheels popped up again in some types of projection TVs, the ones that use a single monochrome DLP, digital light processing chip to create the image. They flash the colors sequentially using a wheel.
It's amazing how this core idea using red, green, and blue just kept reappearing even as the technology around it changed so dramatically. What about the color CRT displays, the big tube TVs and monitors that were standard for decades?
Right. Well, the core technology behind them, the RGB shadow mask for color CRTs, was actually patented in Germany way, way back in 1938.
38 again, before the war.
Yeah. It was this incredibly ingenious design that allowed for very precise placement of tiny red, green, blue phosphor dots on the inside of the screen. And then electron beams would selectively hit just the right dots to light them up and create the colors.
Okay, let's fast forward then to the age of personal computers. I definitely remember those early PCs with really, really limited color options. When did RGB become the standard for computer screens?
Yeah, those early days. The first personal computers, late 70s, early 80s, think Apple II, VIC-20. They typically use composite video output, simple stuff. The Commodore 64, Atari 8-bit machines, they use variations of S-video a bit better. A big step forward was IBM introducing the Color Graphics Adapter, or CGA, in 1981.
CGA, right. I remember that acronym.
It offered a 16-color palette. It used 4 bits, basically. 1 bit to control if red was on or off, 1 for green, 1 for blue, plus an overall intensity bit.
So on or off, not much range.
No, very limited. It was improved a bit with the Enhanced Graphics Adapter, EGA, in 1984, but still, a small, fixed set of colors compared to now.
Definitely.
The first true color card for PCs, meaning millions of colors, was actually TrueVision's Targa card in 1987. But it was quite specialized. What really propelled RGB into the mainstream for PC displays was the arrival of the Videographics Array, or VGA, also in 1987.
Ah, VGA. That one really stuck around.
It did. And the crucial difference with VGA was its use of analog signals for the connection between the graphics card and the monitor.
Analog, not digital.
Right. That analog connection allowed for a vastly wider range of possible RGB color values to be sent to the monitor. Initially, even VGA cards often used limited color palettes and software to save memory. But because of that underlying analog link, later cards, often called Super VGA or SVGA from various manufacturers, were able to add true color capabilities. By about 1992, you started seeing true color Super VGA hardware being heavily marketed. So that shift to analog signaling was really key to unlocking the potential of RGB on PCs.
That's a really interesting point, the analog connection making the difference. Okay, so now fast forward again. RGB is absolutely everywhere in our modern devices. How's it actually used in the displays we look at every single day, our phones, laptops, TVs?
Well, at its heart, the fundamental principle is still pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Whether you're looking at an old CRT, an LCD, a plasma screen, or a modern OLED display. Each individual pixel you see on that screen is actually made up of 3 incredibly tiny light sources, 1 red, 1 green, and 1 blue, often called subpixels.
Yeah, pixels.
And when you look at the screen from a normal viewing distance, your eye can't distinguish these separate little lights. Your brain just blends them together.
And you see a single solid color.
Exactly. And all those millions of pixels working together, each displaying its own specific blend of red, green, and blue, create the full color image you see.
And I assume there's some pretty sophisticated digital processing happening behind the scenes to control the brightness, the intensity of each of those tiny red, green, and blue subpixels very precisely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
During digital image processing, the color intended for each pixel is stored in the computer's memory, or the graphics card's memory, as numerical values for those RG and B components.
Okay.
Those digital values then usually get converted into actual light intensities or voltages using that process we touched on earlier, gamma correction.
Right, the nonlinearity thing.
Exactly. It's a way to compensate for how screens actually produce light, so the perceived brightness matches the intended brightness. It's standard practice.
Okay.
And interestingly, while RGB is the standard, some companies have experimented. Sharp's Quadtron technology, for instance, took a slightly different path by adding a yellow subpixel alongside the traditional red, green, and blue.
Oh yeah, I remember hearing about that. What was the idea there?
The goal primarily was to increase the range of colors, the gamut, that the display could produce, particularly in the yellows and golds. But yeah, even when there are variations or additions like that, RGB is still pretty much the underlying foundation.
Gotcha. What about in the broader video electronics world? Beyond just computer monitors, how is RGB used there?
Well, RGB is also used as a type of high-quality component video signal.
Component video, like those red, green, and blue cables?
Sometimes, yes, though component video can also refer to formats like YPBPR. But true RGB component video involves transmitting the red, green, and blue components of the video signal on 3 completely separate cables or paths.
Okay.
This approach is known for delivering really excellent picture quality. It was actually quite common in Europe, often used with the SCART connector.
SCART, that big rectangular plug.
That's the one. In that context, you might see it called RGBS, where the S indicates a separate synchronization signal is also carried. And this RGBS is directly compatible with the RGBHV signals used for computer monitors, like the ones using the old 15-pin VGA connector, or sometimes 5 separate B and C connectors. The HV stands for horizontal and vertical sync signals, carried separately.
Okay.
Outside of Europe, though, for standard consumer video connections, S-video was generally more prevalent than RGB component for a long time. But as we discussed, pretty much all computer monitors globally have relied on RGB signaling for decades.
So for the best possible analog video quality, RGB was often the way to go. Now let's dive into what's happening inside the computer itself. You mentioned the frame buffer earlier. How does RGB fit into that picture?
Where the frame buffer. It's essentially a dedicated chunk of digital memory RAM that holds the color information for every single pixel that needs to be shown on the screen.
Okay, like a map of the screen's color.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Software running on your computer's main processor, or more likely the GPU, the graphics processor, writes the specific color values into this frame buffer memory to build up the image you eventually see.
And how are those colors stored?
Well, in modern systems, it's very common to allocate 8 bits of data to represent the intensity of each of the red, green, and blue components for every pixel. That's 24 bits per pixel in total.
8 bits. That's 0 to 255 for each color.
Correct. So this full 24-bit RGB information can be stored directly for each pixel in the frame buffer.
Okay.
Alternatively, especially in older systems or for specific purposes like making palettes for games or simple graphics, the system might use something called indexed color graphics.
Indexed color, what's that?
It uses a separate color lookup table, often called a CLUT, or just a palette.
CLUT. Okay. Sounds like a way to be more efficient with memory, maybe.
Exactly. A CLUT is like a small, predefined list stored in memory that contains a limited set of specific RGB color values.
Right.
Maybe only 256 colors, for example. Each color in this palette gets assigned a unique index number.
Right.
Then, instead of storing the full 24-bit RGB value for each pixel in the main frame buffer, the image data only needs to store the index number that points to the desired color in the CLUT for that pixel.
So you store a smaller number, an index, instead of the full color data.
Precisely. This can significantly reduce the amount of memory needed to store the image, which was crucial back when memory was expensive. But it also limits the total number of distinct colors you can display in that image at any one time to the size of your palette.
Makes sense. But now memory is cheaper.
Exactly. So we've largely moved towards directly storing the RGB values using formats like RGB24. That's 8 bits each for R, G, and B, giving you over 16.7 million possible color combinations, what we often call true color.
True color, right.
Some image file formats like PNG or TGA even include an extra 8-bit channel, usually for transparency or alpha masking. Sometimes people refer to this as RGB32, even though it's really 24 bits of color plus 8 bits of alpha.
Okay.
And for displaying scenes with a really huge range of brightness, like in high dynamic range or HDR, imaging, you need even more bits per color component to capture those subtle variations in light, maybe 10, 12, or even 16 bits per primary.
So we've gone from very limited palettes with indexed color to literally millions or even billions of colors, thanks to more memory and processing power. Now, you mentioned gamma correction a couple of times, and it sounds pretty important. Can you explain that concept a bit more simply? What is gamma?
Sure. Think of it like this. Older CRT displays, and even modern displays sometimes, but especially CRTs, have this natural tendency. They didn't output light in a perfectly linear way compared to the input signal.
Meaning
if you sent it a signal that was exactly halfway to maximum brightness, you wouldn't necessarily get 50% of the maximum light output.
Oh, okay. What would you get?
Typically, you'd get something significantly less bright. The relationship between the input voltage or digital value and the actual brightness produced followed a curve, not a straight line. This curve is described mathematically by something called a gamma value, often written with the Greek letter gamma. For most displays, this value is somewhere around 2.0 to 2.5. So as an example, if you sent an input signal of 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, halfway for red, green, and blue to a display with a gamma of 2.2, the actual light output might only be around 22% of the maximum brightness, not 50%.
Wow, that would definitely make images look darker in the midtones, wouldn't it? A bit off.
Precisely. Everything would look kind of murky and crushed in the middle grays and colors. So to compensate for this inherent nonlinearity in the display, a gamma correction is applied when the image data is originally encoded or saved.
So you adjust the image file itself?
Yes. This pre-correction essentially brightens the midtones of the image in the digital file before it gets sent to the display. It applies the inverse of the display's expected gamma curve.
Oh, okay.
So that when the gamma-corrected image is shown on a display with its inherent gamma, the two effects cancel each other out, and the perceived brightness levels end up looking much close to what was originally intended, much more linear and natural.
So it's like the image is intentionally made a little bit brighter in the middle tones beforehand, knowing that the screen will naturally darken those tones anyway.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a crucial step for accurate display.
It really is. Gamma correction is a standard part of how almost all digital still images and video are handled, including in TV broadcasting standards.
Got it. Let's move on to how RGB is used in actually capturing images in cameras.
Right. Well, in older color TV and video cameras, before digital sensors became widespread in the 90s, the incoming light from the lens was actually physically split into its red, green, and blue components, usually using a system of prisms and special color filters called dichroic filters.
Split the light itself.
Yeah. Each of these separate color light paths, red, green, blue, then went to its own dedicated video camera tube. These were basically a type of cathode ray tube, but designed to capture light rather than display it, like vacuum tubes, sensitive to light.
Wow, 3 tubes per camera. Sounds bulky. It was. But then came the advancements in CCD, charge-coupled device technology, starting significantly in the 1980s. These solid-state sensors gradually replaced those bulky pickup tubes.
Right, CCDs.
And that shift is what led to much smaller, more integrated camcorders. And today, of course, the cameras in our webcams and mobile phones are the super miniaturized descendants of that CCD and later CMOS technology.
And what about digital still cameras, the kind we use for photos? Do they work the same way?
They also work with variations of the RGB model, Whether they use CMOS sensors, which are more common now, or CCDs, a very common technique is the use of something called a Baird filter array.
Baird filter? What's that?
It's a grid, like a microscopic checkerboard, tiny color filters placed directly over the sensor's individual pixels. Each pixel on the sensor itself is just measuring light intensity. It's monochrome. The filter tells it which color's intensity to measure.
Okay.
And the pattern of these filters is very specific. Typically, there are twice as many green filters as there are red or blue filters, usually in a ratio like 1 red, 2 green, 1 blue.
More green. Why?
It's because our eyes are more sensitive to changes in luminance or brightness, which green contributes most to. Having more green pixels helps the camera capture finer detail and perceive sharpness in the image.
Ah, interesting.
The typical Bayer filter pattern might look like this. One row could be red, green repeating, and the row below it might be green, blue, and that 2-row pattern continues across the whole sensor.
So each pixel only captures one color. How do you get a full RGB image then?
Good question. Because each pixel under that Bayer filter only sees red or green or blue light, the camera's internal processor has to perform a crucial step called demosaicing.
Demosaicing, okay.
It basically uses clever algorithms to intelligently guess or interpolate the missing 2 color values for each pixel based on the values of its neighboring pixels.
So it fills in the blanks.
Exactly. It reconstructs a full RGB color value for every single pixel. And then usually the camera software also includes a step where this raw camera RGB data gets converted and mapped into a standard color space, most often sRGB, before saving the JPEG file.
So even though the sensor captures filtered light, the camera's brain effectively puts it all back together into a standard RGB image.
Cool. What about scanners, the devices we use to digitize, paper documents or photos? How do they use RGB?
Image scanners, whether it's the flatbed scanner you might have at home, or a high-end drum scanner for professional work, or a film scanner for negatives and slides.
Okay.
They generally all support RGB color scanning.
Okay.
They work by shining light onto the original image or through the film, and then using sensors to measure the intensity of the light that's reflected or transmitted.
Right.
And interestingly, even early telephotography devices, which were kind of precursors to modern scanners, sometimes transmitted color images as 3 separate black and white scans, each captured through a red, green, or blue filter, and then sent one after another. Similar idea to Maxwell's photos.
Very similar concept, yeah. Modern scanners predominantly use either CCD sensors, like cameras, or something called CIS contact image sensors to capture the light. Older, high-end drum scanners used photomultiplier tubes, which are extremely sensitive light detectors.
And how do they get the color? Filters again?
Often, yes. Early color film scanner, for instance, frequently used a single white light source and a rotating wheel with red, green, and blue filter segments. The scanner would have to make 3 separate passes over the film, one for each color.
3 passes. Must have been slow.
It could be. And another issue was heat. Traditional light sources like halogen lamps could get hot and potentially damage delicate film over time. So later scanners increasingly transitioned to using cooler light sources like LEDs, often with separate red, green, and blue LEDs that could be flashed sequentially, eliminating the need for filters and reducing heat.
Makes sense. It really seems like RGB has been this foundational element for capturing and reproducing color across so many different technologies for such a long time. Now let's get practical. How do we actually represent these RGB colors using numbers?
Right, so a specific color within the RGB model is typically described by what's called an RGB triplet. It's usually written as RGB parentheses with 3 values inside.
Okay.
Each letter represents the intensity value for the red, green, and blue component, respectively, in that order. And each of these components can have a value that ranges from a minimum, which is always 0, meaning that color component is completely off.
Right, no light.
Up to some defined maximum value. When all 3 components are 0, 0, 0, you get black. No light at all.
Makes sense.
Conversely, when all 3 components are at their maximum possible value, whatever that is for the system, you get the brightest white that system can represent.
And that maximum value, it isn't always the same number, is it? I feel like I've seen different ranges.
It's exactly right. It can be expressed in a few common ways depending on the context. For more theoretical work, or in systems that use floating point math, the range for each component is often defined as being from 0.0 up to 1.0.
Okay, 0 to 1.
You might also see it just expressed as a percentage from 0% to 100%.
Right.
But by far the most common way you'll see it in computers and digital imaging today is using 8-bit unsigned integers.
8-bit, that gives you.
That gives you a range from 0 up to 255 for each of the red, green, and blue components. 2 to the power of 8 is 256 possible values, counting 0.
0 to 55, that's the number I see a lot.
Yeah, and that 0 to 55 range is often written either in regular decimal notation, like 25500 for the brightest possible pure red.
Okay.
Or very commonly, especially in web design and programming, in hexadecimal notation. That same bright red would be hashtag FF000. F is hexadecimal for 255.
Hashtag FF000.
Got it. And then in more specialized high-end equipment, professional video, high-end imaging, you might see even larger integer ranges used to get more precision, like 0 to 1023, which uses 10 bits per color.
Or 0 to 65535, using 16 bits per color. And sometimes even larger values when you're dealing with very high color depths, maybe 24, 32, 48, or even 64 bits in total across the 3 components.
So the more bits you use for each component, the more subtle the steps between colors can be, finer gradations.
That's the general idea, yeah. More potential colors, smoother gradients. Although remember that gamma correction thing we talked about?
Right.
Those numerical values, especially the common 0255 ones, are often managed non-linearly because of gamma correction being built into standards like sRGB or image file formats. But even with just 8 bits per component, giving that 16.7 million total combinations, you can get very realistic, high-quality color reproduction when gamma correction is handled properly.
Okay.
And just as a side note, there are also mathematical formulas that let you convert between RGB and other ways of describing color, like HSI hue, saturation intensity, or HSL, HSV. These models sometimes describe color in a way that feels more intuitive to humans than just raw RGB numbers. Right, like picking from a color wheel. Okay. And the number of bits used for each R, G, and B component, is that what people mean when they talk about the color depth?
Precisely, yeah. Color depth refers directly to the number of bits used to represent each color component. It determines the number of possible distinct values, the quantization, for red, green, and blue individually, and therefore it determines the total number of distinct color combinations the system can represent overall.
Yeah.
You'll hear about common color depths, like, 1 bit per component, just black or white for each, maybe 2 bits, 4 bits, 5 bits. Then the very common 8 bits per component, which gives you that 24-bit true color.
Right.
And then 10, 12, 16 bits or more per component. Yeah. Especially for HDR or professional applications.
Gotcha. Now, I remember reading something in the source about visualizing the RGB model as a shape, like geometrically. How does that work?
Yeah, the color cube.
Yeah.
Because we have these 3 mostly independent components, red, green, and blue, we can actually think about the RGB color model in 3D space, like a geometric shape. Yeah. Imagine a standard 3-dimensional cube in what's called a Euclidean space, like using X, Y, and Z axes.
Right, like in math class.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, let's say the intensity value for red ranges from 0 to 1 along the X-axis. Green goes from 0 to 1 along the A-axis. And blue from 0 to 1 along the Z-axis.
Okay, a 0 to 1 cube.
Right. In this model, the origin of the cube, the point 0, 0, 0, represents black. No red, no green, no blue line.
That makes sense.
And the corner diagonally opposite to the origin, the point 1, 1, 1, represents pure white. Red, green, and blue, all at their maximum intensity.
Okay.
So any specific RGB triplet, like 0.5, 0.2, 0.8, or whatever, corresponds to a unique point located somewhere inside that color cube, or maybe on one of its faces or edges, or at one of the corners.
So every possible RGB color is just a point in this cube.
Exactly. And thinking about it geometrically, like, this can be really useful sometimes. For instance, you can calculate how visually similar two different colors are by just measuring the straight line distance between their corresponding points inside the cube.
Ah, okay. Closer points mean more similar colors.
Right. It's also helpful for understanding that gamut concept we talked about, visualizing which colors are inside the achievable cube and which might be outside or out of gamut for a particular RGB system.
That's actually a really helpful way to visualize the whole range of colors possible within the RGB model.
Cool. Now let's talk about something I think a lot of our listeners will have encountered directly, maybe without even realizing it, RGB in web page design.
Ah, yes, web colors. Good old hashtag FS0000.
Right. So back in the very early days of the web, things were different, weren't they? I remember limited colors.
Oh, yeah. Back then, many computer video cards and the monitors attached to them had serious limitations on the number of colors they could display at the same time, maybe only 256 colors total.
Right.
This led to the creation of the somewhat infamous web-safe color palette.
Web-safe, I remember that term.
Yeah, it was this specific set of just 216 RGB colors that were supposedly guaranteed to render reasonably consistently without dithering on any system at the time, regardless of its color limitations.
Only 216. How did they choose them? It was quite systematic, actually. They created it by only using 6 specific hexadecimal values, hashtag 00, hashtag 33, hashtag 67, hashtag 99, hashtag ZC, and hashtag FF for each of the red, green, and blue components. 6 options for red, times 6 for green, times 6 for blue. That gives you 6 by 6 by 6 equals 216 colors.
Ah, okay. A 6 by 6 by 6 color cube within the big one.
Exactly. But there was a catch, because many of those early computer systems lacked proper gamma correction.
Right, the brightness curve thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Many of these supposedly web-safe colors actually appeared really, really dark on standard displays of the time. They weren't perceptually spread out very well.
I vaguely remember things looking muddy sometimes back then. Thankfully, things have definitely moved on quite a bit.
Oh, hugely, yeah. With the almost universal adoption of 24-bit color displays on pretty much all modern computers, laptops, tablets, phones, we can now confidently use the full spectrum of 16.7 million colors available through the standard HTML RGB color code.
So we don't need the web-safe palette anymore.
Not really, no. We don't have to worry about major rendering issues or weird dithering for the vast majority of people viewing a web page. The sRGB color space, which we mentioned earlier, that was formally adopted as the standard color space for use in HTML way back with version 3.2, although honestly it had been the de facto standard for a while even before that.
Okay.
So today, web browsers and operating systems generally handle color management pretty well behind the scenes. They'll typically interpret any images or color values specified in HTML and CSS as being within that standard sRGB color space by default, unless you specifically tell them otherwise.
So when we see a color defined in CSS, the styling language for websites, with something like RGB 25500, the browser just assumes that means sRGB red.
Exactly. The standard CSS syntax for specifying RGB colors is RGB, where RGB are those decimal values, 0 to 255 usually, for red, green, and blue.
Right.
And use that syntax in CSS properties like background color to set the background or color to set the text color.
Makes sense.
And what's really exciting is that more recently, starting around 2023 or so, modern CSS specifications have even added support for wider gamut color spaces.
Wider than sRGB.
Yeah, like DCI-P3, which is common on many newer Apple devices and some TVs. This allows web developers to actually utilize a much broader range of colors, more vibrant reds and greens especially, on displays that can actually show them.
How do you specify that?
There's a new syntax, like color display P3 RGB, where RG and B are usually floating point values between 0.0 and 1.0, representing the color within that specific DCI P3 color space.
That's great to see the web platform evolving to actually take advantage of better screen technology. Awesome. Now, in professional fields, graphic design, photography, video, where getting the color exactly right is absolutely critical. I know there's a huge emphasis on color management. How does RGB fit into those workflows?
Right. In those professional environments, yeah, ensuring consistent and accurate color reproduction across all the different devices involved is absolutely paramount. You know, from the camera capturing the image to the monitor you edit on to the final display or the printer. Many of these devices, as we've seen, utilize the RGB model at some stage in the process. Color management is essentially the whole system and process for performing transparent conversions between different color spaces.
Conversions between
Device-independent color spaces, standardized ones like sRGB, Adobe RGB, or even more abstract ones like CIE XYZ or CIE LS, Cherokee,
Right.
and the device-dependent color spaces like the specific RGB profile of your particular monitor or the CMYK profile of your specific printer and paper combination.
And the goal is consistency.
Exactly. The goal is to maintain color fidelity, the appearance of the colors, as accurately as possible throughout that entire production pipeline. But it's really important to understand that these conversions, especially when you're trying to represent colors from a wide gamut space on a device with a more limited gamut that's called gamut mapping or gamut reduction.
Right. Fitting the big triangle into a smaller one.
Sort of, yeah. That process can potentially lead to a loss of some color accuracy or subtle detail or saturation. It's unavoidable sometimes.
So how do pros deal with that?
Well, one way is to minimize the damage. Professional tools often work with images that have a higher bit depth, remember, more bits per color.
Yeah, 16-bit instead of 8-bit.
Exactly. Maybe 16 bits per channel, giving you 48 bits per pixel total for RGB. This provides more room for calculations during conversions and helps minimize rounding errors and banding artifacts.
Okay.
And applications that are compliant with ICC profiles. That's the International Color Consortium standard for profiles. They often use a standardized intermediary color space like CIE or the CIE 1931 XYZ color space as a kind of neutral ground, a profile connection space, when they're translating colors between different device profiles.
So color management is basically this whole complex system to make sure as best as possible that the same shade of red looks like the same shade of red, whether you're looking at it on your calibrated monitor or printed proof or sending it to someone else.